Yeah, the Messengers documentary, it's interesting because it started off with, it was supposed to be them filming Podfest last year. And so I went to Podfest. It was a really great event. And they said, hey, would you be interested in being interviewed for this thing? And I'm like, sure, I'll talk about podcasting anytime, twist my arm. And so I went in a room and talked to some folks and met some people I never met before. And they're working on lighting and all this other stuff. And yeah, I thought that was it, really. And the next thing I know, I saw other people going in there, and everybody was kind of getting to know each other, and it seemed really great. And I'm walking around Walmart, minding my own business, and I get a call from Chris Kermitso saying, "Hey, you know that thing that you did in Florida?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "Okay, well, we're gonna turn it into a movie." And I'm not sure. I thought he was just gonna make like a promo for Podfest next year, and boy, did he! It's gonna be somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes long, I'm assuming at this point. And he said, "Yeah, we're gonna make this into a documentary movie." And I'm like, "Oh, cool, neat, wow, awesome." And he goes, "Yeah, and we want you to make a podcast about it." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. So you're going to make a movie about podcasting, and you want me to make a podcast about the movie about podcasting? We almost need a scorecard now to keep track of that." And I said, "Sure, I've never done a podcast like that." I said, "How do you see this?" And he said, "Well, kind of in an NPR kind of style." And by that, I was like, "That's interesting, because I don't consider myself an NPR style podcaster where today we're going to be talking about, that kind of stuff." And but I did like the idea of pieces parting one together. And so I was like, "Hey, I've never done one of those. I'll give it a shot." And so my first tip for today, and boy, following Stephen Hart, how I was like, can somebody else go next? Holy cow! But my one tip for this would be, realize that it's funny when you have a podcast going, or in my case, four, um, and somebody else says, "Hey, do you want to start a podcast?" You forget how hard it is to get a podcast going. And when you're doing one that you've never done before, in a style you've never done before, that means there's this little thing called a learning curve. And boy, was that a lot of fun. And that's why I said I'll put this out as often as I can. I said I'll try to do it weekly, which we did for a little bit, and we've hit some snags. But the movie itself, you can find at themessengersdoc.com. And if you want to hear the podcast, it's at themessengersdoc.com/podcast. Now, what's really interesting about it, especially now that Chris has kind of got in full force, is you kind of have to be careful, because Chris just walks around all the time with a portable recorder and records everything. I mean, everything. And so he'll call me on the phone, and we purposely, now I gave him my Google number, and he'll call me. He's like, "Yeah, I'm in the middle of so-and-so, want to talk to you some stuff." And I go, "Hold on." And the first thing I got to do is hit number 4. So it starts recording the phone call. Cause a lot of times he's catching me in the middle of nowhere. And it's just a way that I can record every phone call I have with him, every Skype call, just everything gets recorded, because you never know how big a piece of the puzzle that phone call you're about to have is. And that's one of the things that I've learned about doing a story podcast. If I were to do this again, I would do it after the movie was published, and then go back and do the making of the movie. Well, the fun thing is that story hasn't been finished yet. They're going to be previewing it in Orlando at Podfest 2017. But how we're going to get there, well, we're getting there now as we speak. So it's been a lot of fun in the fact that we're kind of making it up as we go along, which in itself is kind of fun. You can't really it gives you a little bit of a license to just do whatever you want, because we didn't know what it was doing. And I'm sure as we go along, it'll get better. I know everybody loves episode 3. One of the things that they've done with this documentary is Chris is focusing on, and I'm not sure I'm crazy about this term, but independent podcasters. And what that basically means is I don't have a team of 18. And again, the NPRs, the Gimlets of the world, these people have teams. When they say, yes, today's show was edited by, Jim Johnson, and our executive producer is like, I don't have one of those. I don't have a music creator. And so on one hand, I just think we're all content creators. It's kind of cool if I had a team of 18 behind me, but I get that. And so he's focusing on some of the independent folks that are now hitting it out of the park. So Danny Pena has a great story. The guy started out with a cassette deck back in the day, right? He had a cassette deck and was walking around just recording everything. And he's really into the gaming world. And what's interesting is the director, Neil Galarte, went with Danny out to California to that big giant gaming thing, E3, I want to say is what it's called. And Danny was like a god. I mean, you walk in that place and it's like, yeah, I'm Danny Pena. You can kiss my ring. It's just, that's how Danny is now. It's hilarious. And so after day one, Neil was like, man, that's amazing. And they're like, oh yeah, we got 2 more days of this. So it's just amazing to follow Danny around. And when you follow Danny, you will then see Danny with everywhere he goes, he brings his audience. He invites his audience. When he was inducted into the Podcaster Hall of Fame, he reserved seats in the front row for his family, for his audience, because he realizes that without an audience, you don't have a podcast. So that was really interesting. If you've never heard of Glenn Hebert, you might know him better as Glenn the Geek. He now has a whole website with just a network of shows, and they talk about one thing and one thing only, and that is horses. And it's at horseradionetwork.com. And what's interesting is Glenn was a guy, I interviewed him a couple years ago after Podcast Movement, whatever it would have been 2014. And I met Glenn, and he stood up and just spewed stuff that I'd been talking about, focusing on your audience and don't get hung up on stats and this and that. And literally, Glenn had just kind of gotten the whole picture on iTunes. So here he was making a living with his podcast, not focusing on, getting up the charts. He wasn't worried about his launch. The thing that gets me, you guys ready for a quick tangent here? So many people get hung up on this launch thing, and I wouldn't care about it, but there are people now that are quitting before they launch. Like they're going, yeah, I've only got 18 episodes in the can. I can't. I'm like, what'd you make those for? Let somebody listen to those, would you? And to me, focusing. So if you just have a big launch, you'll have a successful podcast, is like saying, if I have a really big wedding, I'll have a successful marriage. There's a whole lot more work goes into a marriage after the wedding. If you're married, you know what I'm talking about. So not that a big launch is bad, but it's not the only thing. That's where if you've ever written a book, it's one thing to write a book. It's another thing to get people to listen to it. So Glenn didn't know a thing about iTunes. I shouldn't say a thing, but he wasn't focused on it. And he, exactly, Todd, you just record, release. And so he put a thing in the School of Podcasting Facebook group. And I had an episode where somebody literally quit their podcast because they didn't get into the magical world of New and Noteworthy. And Glenn said, Dave, I just listened to the latest episode of the School of Podcasting. That's where I was joking earlier, Stephen, about SOP. The letter about New and Noteworthy and giving up after 8 weeks made me so sad and mad at the same time. He says, I went back to my really old spreadsheets from our first shows 8 years ago. He said, we had 12 listeners after 3 months. So this was 8 years ago. It would have been 2008. So 12 listeners after 3 months, 67 listeners after 6 months. So he had gone up 5 times his listeners after 6 months, and 123 after 1 year. Now, fast forward 8 years, he's getting ready to hit their they've done 5,000 episodes. And he says what enabled them to do this, and this is what Stephen was talking about, things like, it's time to turn off Game of Thrones because it'll be there, and just focus on your craft. And he says hard work and persistence. We've never missed an episode in 5,000 episodes, and that was very hard. He's not saying, oh yeah, it's fun. No, it was hard. He says, like anything we do in life, podcasting is not easy. It is hard work and persistence. He goes, our successes come from a ton of man hours every single week, but we're willing to do the work so we can eat and have the most fun job ever. He said, so whoever's out there preaching that you can just put out a show and the masses will come and listen, they're just wrong. It's like any other business. It takes dedication and constant effort. And he then said, okay, I'm done. because he thought he was being too negative. But exactly. So Glenn is in the movie, and if you want to hear Glenn, see, I'm cautious about this because I don't want to seem like I'm pitching stuff. But if you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/Glenn, so GLENN and the number 1, you'll hear how he goes about getting sponsors, and he throws everything out the window. He doesn't do CPM ads. He's an amazing dude, and that's what's interesting. That's one of the great things about podcasting is you don't have to do it like everybody else is doing it. Everybody thinks there's one recipe. There's not, because we're all completely different. Our audiences are completely different, and nobody's going to punch you in the face if you want to try something different. So Glenn is in the documentary, and it was interesting is they've been going around to different people's places, and they cover Sean Smith is a guy who is a missionary in Guatemala, and so they followed Sean down to film him doing his work, because what he does is he does this work, but he wants to get the word out about what's going on in Guatemala, because it's this is a place where people spend the entire day just to go get water, and so they went down and filmed him in Guatemala and got some really great footage. It's just amazing. And what is happening then is you're seeing people that are like Danny, that are interacting with their audience, like Glenn, who focuses on his audience. And then you have Sean, who is focused really on his audience to the point where he's a missionary. And these are all people either helping people, they're educating people, they're entertaining people, and they're giving people information you can't get anyplace else. And that's really some of the main ingredients of a podcast. I always tell people you need to make them laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain. And, that's the key. And I was one of the things I always say is when you look at shows that you do watch, and we just talked about how a lot of us don't watch TV anymore. I turned on The Voice the other night. I actually recorded it because I've never seen it, and I know it's really, really popular. And then I watched it, not with it to kind of see if I enjoyed it. I completely picked apart, like, how did they put together this show? And that show is all about tension and release. Tension and release, because it's like, ooh, well, first of all, you have the big story, right? The background story. So my dad was in the Army, and we moved 55 times by the time I was 7 years old. My mom was a crack whore or whatever. All these really sad stories. But I thought if I could just sing and if I could get on The Voice, this would change my life. So then you're like, ooh, the tension. Are they going to get picked? And then if they do get picked, ooh, the tension. Who's going to pick them? Is it going to be Adam or Blake, or is it Miley or anybody? Tension and release. So you got to think about that. And we do that with podcasting with a tease. When you're at the end of your episode, you can say, hey, next week, I'm going to be talking with Todd Cochran from the New Media Show, or I'm going to be talking with whoever, and he's going to drop something about stats that you've never heard of. Are you going to tell me somebody's not going to tune into that? So anytime you can kind of tease your audience either at the beginning of the show and then get them to stay tuned, or if you know what's coming up next week, do that and let it go. And so that's one of the things we've been kind of doing with this podcast is it's weird. I almost have to work on 2 episodes at a time, because I'll have the one episode, and at the end of that episode, I need to know, what am I teasing for the next episode? And it's hard to make that episode because, well, in that episode, I want to tease what's after the next episode. So it's this whole kind of weird thing that's been going on. And it's going to be interesting to see, as you'll see. I hope to have an episode out Monday. But the next couple episodes are going to be very interesting, because things are going to get ugly. You're going to hear how behind the scenes things just got like butt ugly. And when I tell people, if you're going to do a podcast with your friends, and hey, I've known, Skip since we were 6 years old in the garage, and we're just going to do a show. And guess what? You and Skip made a podcast that's really, really popular. And then you get sponsors. Oops. In the immortal words of Cyndi Lauper, money changes everything. And you might want to get you and Skip into an office to say, here's what happens if we get money. Because if you don't do that, things get ugly. I'm telling you. So stay tuned for the Messengers podcast. There's a tease. right there, coming up on that episode. But the footage is beautiful, and the fun part now, and a lesson you can learn from this, if you ever try to do a storytelling podcast, is because you kind of grab everything because you don't know really which piece of the puzzle you're going to use, document everything. So what I mean by that is if I have a call with, let's say I have a Skype call with Neil, the director. When I get done, I'll say, okay, Skype call with Neil on this date. We talked about blank, and I put as much as I can there, any tidbits there. And then as I'm listening to it back, I'm also putting, he talked about the women on the hill at the 11-minute mark and 36 seconds. Because what will happen is you'll remember that you have these pieces, you're like, oh, this would be a great place for the woman on the hill story. And then you're like, oh, where was that? And then you look over and you've got 17 files. And you're like, okay, 5 of those are Neil. Wow, that's about 5 hours worth of stuff I have to listen to now to find the woman on the hill story. So as you're listening to this stuff, document it. And on one hand, you might be documenting a lot of stuff that you may never use. But when you do that, the time you spend there, you will save tons of time later when you go to find that thing. And let's see here. Todd says, the challenge with these documentaries are sometimes they become self-serving. No, this is really, it's spotlighting, and that's why a lot of people got involved with this podcast or with this documentary, is it's showing how, I mean, so many people go to start a podcast and they're like, why would anyone listen to me? You know, why? I'm just some dude from Akron, Ohio. Why would anybody listen to me? And the guy that came up with the name is escaping me, Steve something. But Steve has colon cancer and does the colon cancer podcast. And so he started this podcast about kind of dealing with that. And now that he's gone through whatever he's gone through, I don't know his full story. But Chris asked him, they go, well, what do you consider yourself with your podcast? And he goes, oh, it's easy. He goes, I'm a messenger because I really wish somebody would have given me this message years ago. I could have avoided all this stuff. And so that's where the name of the documentary comes from. So it's really focusing on the people and why they do it. And it's interesting because the executive producer, Chris Krimitsos, is kind of the Barbara Walters of podcasting. He really digs into, Stephen was talking earlier about the why. Like, why do people do this? And we're finding out that there's, I think in the heart of most, thank you, Lee Silverstein. Thank you. Tell him what he's won. It's a cheese straightener. There you go, Dave. And at the heart of most podcasters, I think there's a serving gene. We want to serve our audience, whether it's to make them laugh or cry or think or groan. But there's something we want to move people to, and it's not so much. I don't think there's so much about ego. Now, let's not be stupid. There's definitely an ego in there, but it's interesting how either something has happened in their life that, like, I wanted to talk to Stephen a little bit. Stephen grew up in Jamaica, and I'm finding something, and I don't want to get all like the more people I talk to that didn't grow up in this country, okay, I don't want to bash Americans because I am one of them. Oh, that's bad. But the more I talk with people who didn't grow up in this country, the more motivated I see they are. And I sometimes, am I going to say this out loud? Sometimes I think we feel we're a little entitled to things that just come to them, where people that weren't born here come here and go get it. And I think we need that attitude a little bit sometimes, that we have to go get it a little more. And so it's interesting that you see these people that are just, again, Danny started with a cassette deck. Glenn, they call him Glenn the Geek, but he'll be the first to tell you. He had a sales job before this, and he did a little, what do you call it, where you improv theater, but he wasn't by any means a big giant geek. He was kind of a geek, but he learned a little bit here and there. So it's all these people that just started, and because they started, and this is one of the things that's kind of my new little mantra this week, is podcasting leads to relationships. So let's go there. Podcasting leads to relationships. Relationships lead to opportunities. And those opportunities, you guessed it, lead to more relationships, which lead to, you guessed it, more opportunities. And some of those opportunities give you exposure. Some of them give you money. Some of them give you relationships that will just add so much value to your life. That, I mean, I have some of my best friends I've never actually met in person, but I email them on a weekly basis. I get on Skype with them. And it's just one of those things that's how you kind of build your audience one at a time. And so the documentary focuses on these people. Now, for the record, it also has John Lee Dumas in it. And I think that's the part there. I think we should bring in Robin Leach, for those of you that remember Robin Leach, because he's like, look at the champagne caviar. Yeah, because John Lee Dumas has like a $2 million house down there in Puerto Rico. And so John is in the movie. And the reason they had him in the movie is because a lot of people were talking about John in the movie. And they said, well, we should probably have him in there. But Daniel J. Lewis was in there. They came and interviewed me. And I said, why are you guys coming to Akron, Ohio? I mean, we could film some, old abandoned rubber factories if you like. There's really not much here besides the sign that says home of LeBron James when you drive into the city. But they came to my little apartment and grilled me for about 3 hours. And, again, they really got me to think. And they asked me, they said, well, why are you so passionate about this? Well, my background is in teaching. I've taught in the corporate world for years. But my mom died when I was fairly young. I was 24. And then a few years after that, I had a guy from me to that bed behind me shoot at my car. He was going to carjack me. And I decided to, like, here's the dude. We'll do a little reenactment. Here's guy. Here's my car. And I backed out and pulled away. And when I backed out, he went, geesh, and shot at my car. It bounced off the window and went into the door. So I was kind of like, all right, well, apparently I'm supposed to be on the planet for some reason, because technically on March 26th, I should have been dead, because that thing would have hit me somewhere in the head or neck region. And usually if you get shot in the head, the fatality rate on that is really, really high. I've checked into that a little bit. And so I was kind of like, okay, so I'm not quite sure what the deal is. But my mom's death taught me that, hey, guess what? You only got so many days on this planet. You better make the most of them. That thing taught me, okay, you're here. You better find your purpose or your calling. And so when podcasting dropped on my lap, I was like, oh, this is it, because I get to help people. I get to be creative, and I get to be a little bit of a geek and play with technology. So for me, that's what I love about podcasting. And so you'll see this a lot in the documentary, because you'll see where people are entertaining people because that's what they want to do. Like I said, Glenn has a little bit of a history in improv. He did some sort of improv theater. And so that's kind of one of his itches. He also likes to sell, I'm assuming, because that was part of his thing. So he's selling ads like nobody's business out there. And it's amazing. And then you have other people. We have one woman who is doing a podcast in Mandarin. And so we didn't go to, I'm so stupid. I'm such a dumb American when it comes to stuff like this. China, Japan, someplace where they speak Mandarin. She was in the States, so we interviewed her here. But that's something that's really interesting, and I'm sure Dave sees this. It's not just an American thing, kids. It's a global thing. And so I always want to know, like, who is the Daniel J. Lewis of Spain? Who's the Todd Cochran of Germany? There's got to be somebody, on the other side of the planet. That would be interesting to see. My very first piece of voicemail came from a guy in Germany. And that's what really, really, really sucked me into podcasting, is I was like, wow, there's a guy in Germany listening to me. But so yeah, it'll be a really cool documentary. We're slotted to, again, we're going to view it in Orlando at PodFest. So that's the fun part. Is it sounds weird because I want to say that's I should know the date. I want to say February. It was February last year. Podfest.us. Somebody look that up. I know I'm speaking at it, and I know it's next year. That's why I don't know the date. February 23rd. I knew it was in February. Yay for me. And that sounds like it's a long way off. That's 5 months, folks. And when you've got hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of video, and you have to figure out, okay, again, going back to that same thing, I have a story to tell now. how do I pick all this stuff up and make the best story? And so you want to try to probably get as many people in the movie as you can. But we did meet our funding goal, which was cool. That was something we kind of had to sweat on that one a little bit. But they had a crowdfunding at Kickstarter. And that would be the other thing. We always talk about how, your podcast is kind of a recipe, is what I always say. You can always kind of change it on the fly. And looking back, if I were to do this again, the first 3 episodes are about 20 to 30 minutes long. What I should have been doing during that time is making quick 10-minute episodes to get the word out. And then, of course, ask people to contribute to the film. And then here's another 10-minute one. Instead, we put out 3 episodes in that kind of crowdfunding time. Looking back, I would have made shorter shows with one call to action: please donate to the Kickstarter. And that's one of those things that Stephen earlier was talking about. Why am I doing a podcast? Well, if your podcast is to keep your brand in front of people, make shorter shows and make them twice a week, as opposed to once a week for 60 minutes. Why not 2 30-minute shows a week? And really, the bottom line on that, keep in mind that just because you want to keep your brand out there doesn't mean your audience wants the show 6 days a week. So keep that in mind. When in doubt, ask your audience what they're interested in, because you never know. I know a lot of people are like, well, how long should my podcast be? And somewhere there's a really popular article that says the average commute in America is 20 minutes. Somebody's like, there you go. 20 minutes is what my podcast needs to be, even if I only have 7 minutes worth of material. And I've always said there's a Judy Graff does a show called Farm and Wife, and it's Farm and the letter N, Farm and Wife. And I remember when she brought me her first episode, and it was 3 hours long. And I was like, Judy, this is 3 hours long. And she goes, yeah, I know my audience thinks it's too short. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? And she goes, yeah, my audience is farmers, and they're sitting on a tractor. And she goes, when you see these guys out in just acres and acres and acres, she goes, a lot of that is automated to keep it straight. So you turn the corner, you hit a thing, you hit a button, and the tractor just drives itself super straight. And you're just sitting there going, she goes, so they're bored out of their gourd until it's time to make another turn. And she's like, so they were saying, yeah, they're the 3 hours. They're kind of like, where's the other one? I mean, that was good. I love the first 3 hours. Where's the other 5? And so it really depends on who your audience is. Sometimes I have somebody now that is getting ready to launch a podcast, and she does a newsletter that's just super quick tips. And she says, so I know my audience loves short, quick, to the point stuff. She goes, I'm going to make a podcast. It's twice a week with short, quick, to the point tips, and that's it. And I'm like, there you go. So you already know your audience. And she's also done something very smart. She actually has an audience already. She has a very popular newsletter. And she, again, when in doubt, ask your audience. And she said, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. We're going to turn the newsletter, for those of you that want to listen to it in the car, and turn it into a podcast. Do you want one a week with a bunch of tips, or do you want them sprinkled throughout? And her audience said, hey, I'll take them sprinkled throughout. That way I can get, it just kind of strings it out over the week. I don't have to wait 7 days for another episode of you. So when in doubt, talk to your audience, and they'll let you know. But any questions on any of that at this point? Let's see. I already mentioned Danny Ping is in it. Glenn the Geek, myself, Daniel J. Lewis. I should say we've been videoed. We're not in the movie yet. If you go to themessengersdoc.com, you'll see actually the trailer for it. You'll see this is not a bunch of guys running around with a camcorder that they found in the attic. This is, a professional stuff. And what's really cool, in fact, the next episode that's coming out is some really interesting, entertaining stories about the drone. They actually have this drone that's pretty, I'm doing this like you can see my hands. It's big. And this thing flies, and it's interesting because if you think about, if you're an actual pilot, of course, you have to go to pilot school. You have to have hundreds, if not thousands of hours in the air, and then they let you fly. Not so much with a drone. You can buy one at Walmart and go off to town. And I do believe now they're making laws that you have to register it. So you can't just go up and plug planes and stuff. But those things fly really, really high. And so it's kind of fun when there's a camera trap to tied to that thing because you're trying to get these cool shots. And if you haven't actually mastered the art of flying yet, it makes for some really interesting shots. And in some cases, they get caught in trees, and they almost lost one off a bridge. They were doing this thing, and it kind of went. The wind caught it and was like, "Oops!" And when it's a $1,500 drone, you have to be careful with that. And can I do this and stay in frame? Silly me, I moved over here, and I unplugged my laptop. Dun, 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 the joys of live streaming. That would kind of make the stream go a little dead if all of a sudden my camera just died off. I think I liked it better when the electricity wasn't in here because I remember making this too bright earlier. But I started off saying how this was like now my 5th ongoing podcast, and be careful with that because we do think like once you get one under your belt, you're kind of like, oh yeah, it's a piece of cake, and it's not. It's juggling multiple podcasts is really, really hard. And I know for me, I've been kind of frustrated with myself because I'm getting sloppy because there's still only 24 hours in a day, and I've had some podcasts go out, and with little mistakes that you can always fix later. But nonetheless, when we talk about your podcast being your brand, and you put things out with like 15 seconds of dead air at the end of it with another song coming on, you're like, ugh. And then why is it? Because I know Stephen was talking about releasing podcasts at 2 a.m, which a lot of it do. The problem is when your hair starts to get a little light, that whole 2 a.m. thing, you start writing checks your body can't cash, and you start getting sloppy. So be careful with that. Hey, let's just start a podcast because there's only 24 hours in a day. And this particular storytelling podcast style, I always say with your regular kind of podcast, clown on a 4-to-1 ratio. And by that, I mean, if you want to do a 15-minute podcast, plan on spending an hour on that, right? 15 times 4 is 60. And people go, well, wait a minute. Don't you just talk to a microphone for 15 minutes? And I know there are people like Todd in the chat room that they don't do any post editing, but Todd still has to kind of look at what's going on in the news for his show and figure out what he's going to talk about, and have those links ready if he's going to show anything on the screen, things like that. So there's a little more show prep, and then you can then you do the recording, and even just uploading it. If it's an hour-long show, that'll be another 5-10 minutes depending on your connection and depending on what you created it at. If you're going to type any kind of detailed show notes, there's another 5 to 10 minutes. And by all means, some people do editing, some people don't. Some people write extensive show notes, some people don't do any. So that kind of depends on you. But for me, I've found usually it's a 4-to-1 ratio for your, quote, regular podcast. And I don't even want to try to consider what the ratio is for this thing. It's probably closer to 10-to-1 because I'm having to go through all this material. And that is something they just keep giving me everything, and I listen to it. And so I have all these pieces, parts. Now it's a matter of how do I stitch this into a story? And I'm sure, keep in mind, this is the first time I've done this kind of podcast. And if I do another one, I'm sure there'll be lessons that I'll go, let's not record everything. Let's figure out what we want to show and only record those things, as opposed to, I mean, Chris is recording, calls in the car and all sorts of everything. So the good news is I kind of know early on in the conversation if this is going to make the podcast or not. But it is a fun way to record. And so the other thing I want to point out about this is you'll hear these types of shows on NPR, right? And I don't want to pick on NPR, but all these other different types of podcasts where it's, you have a narrator, and then they play a clip, and then they narrate a little more, and then they play another clip from, Zebediah, and then they have another clip, and then there's another clip from Glem, and then another, and that sounds all neat, and it makes a really cool podcast. But that's where you got to realize some of these people literally have a staff of 18. I was nominated for a podcast award a couple of years ago, and I lost to Reply All, and I was kind of like, oh, what a bummer, I mean, still, it's always an honor to be nominated. And then I found out that there was a staff of 18 at Gimlet. And I'm like, you know what? I don't feel so bad. I might have been a little outmanned there, just a little bit. So keep that in mind, and don't let that stop you from starting a podcast because you're like, oh, I need a team of 18. No, because again, going back to this documentary, you'll see where these are people many cases, a team of one that is going out and they're making content that is literally, in some cases, changing the lives of people. Glenn got a piece of feedback from a doctor, and he said, being a doctor, it's kind of obvious when you change somebody's lives because, hey, they came in, their arm was broke, they walked out, and now they're going to mend, or whatever the deal is. They had surgery, and now they're going to live. That's easy to say, wow, I really changed that person's lives. But he said, your show, Glenn's in this case, Horses in the Morning, he goes, it makes me laugh every time I listen to it. And he goes, and there are days as a doctor that you're dealing with high stress things that it's really easy to be depressed or whatever. Think about that. You have to go out and tell somebody they didn't make it. And he goes, and your show always brightens my day. And he goes, your podcast changes my world. And so I think a lot of us have that imposter syndrome where we think, well, who's going to listen to me or whatever? But you can actually go out and make a positive impact, whether it's making somebody laugh or, they hate their job and on their way home, you make them entertain, or you help take their mind off the fact that they just had a really crappy Thursday. And now you're giving them this information. They're like, oh, wow, that sounds cool. I'm going to have to try that when I get home or whatever it is. So you might just be a really cool distraction. You might be some sort of entertainment. You might be some sort of news that, I don't know about you. One of the pieces of TV that I gave up was the news. And I found out I'm not missing much because if I want to know the weather, I just ask my phone. And other than that, I did miss the big story about Beyonce sneezing a couple weeks ago. But oddly enough, I could actually live without knowing that. And I kind of actually already knew that she sneezed. So it wasn't really that big of a deal. And I don't know about you guys. I'll be glad come December because right now, anytime I do turn on the TV, it's nothing but political ads. And I'm done with that whole process as well. So keep that in mind. The other thing that I can say, how do I do this stuff? I'm juggling all these things. There's a really cool app, and I'm looking for my phone, that there are a couple ways you can do this. You don't need an app to do this. Just simply setting a timer that you say, okay, for the next 45 minutes, I'm going to put my head down and I'm going to write show notes. I hate show notes, but I'm going to write my show notes. Or I'm going to edit this file. I'm going to edit the heck out of this thing right now. And I'm just going to go to town for the next 45 minutes. No Facebook, no YouTube, no emails. Turning off the phone, head down, going to do it. And you'll be amazed at how much stuff you get done. I cannot find, of course, I have 8. Here it is. 3030 is the name of the app. It's this one right here. And what you do is you can go in and say, for 40, for me, I think I have for 50 minutes, do this, for 5 minutes, check email, and then for 10 minutes, get up and walk around. So on the weekends, that's basically what I'm doing, because you do have to actually give yourself a break as well. But you'll be amazed that keeping yourself focused. Stephen was talking about Evernote and Asana. Those are 2 tools I've used. And especially if you have a family that, you've got family comes first. Let's face it. That's just number one. But you might have an idea. Well, if you can put that into an Evernote or an Asana, what that allows you to do is, for me, when I was married, Tuesdays and Thursdays were, quote, the Dave Cave night. And so when it was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I was with the family and we were doing the family thing. But that meant that when I came in on Tuesday, I would just pull up my list on Asana and just, again, turn off YouTube, turn off Facebook, turn off the phone. Here's my to-do list, and just barrel through. And you'd be amazed. I know a lot of us want to multitask, and you think, oh, I'll just watch Netflix while I do my show notes. What happens is actually a misnomer about multitasking, where you think you're doing 2 things at once. And really what it is, they've done studies on this, you're really doing one thing at a time, and you're just switching back and forth really quickly. And in the process, you're losing efficiency. And I know I've done that, back in the day with homework and other things, where you think you're going to do 2 things at once. And if you look at the studies, you're really doing one thing at a time. You're just switching back and forth really quick. and that effort that it takes to go back and forth, if you just did one thing, you'd actually be more productive. And I know it's really easy. I know to me, my favorite Sunday is editing audio and watching football on my computer. And that's where Stephen was mentioned that, that's something I'm not really paying attention to. I'm actually doing the audio, but I can look up and see where things are going. It's not quite as distracting, but be careful with that, with the whole multitasking and things of that nature. Yeah, Todd says show notes equals the gift of Google. More listeners. Yeah, that is true. And it's interesting that I see people that try to get away with a sentence of show notes. And I just don't, it's your show. By all means, you can do what you want. But there's a famous comedian, and I used to be a huge fan of the show. And I just listened to one today, and I went, wow, that's a bummer. And his name is Jay Moore. He does, I love his call-in show on the actual radio, but this is a show he does called More Stories. And the first 3 minutes are commercials. And he now has ad inserts. So when you hear people talk about this automated ad insertion, whoofa, is that horrible. He was interviewing Sugar Ray Leonard, and he said something like, hey, Ray, who was the guy that hit you the hardest? And literally, the minute he paused, it was like, 15 minutes will save you 15%. And I was like, what? So be careful with monetizing your show. I was like, wow, that's a really, really great example of horrible advertising. So be careful with that with your show. Try to make sure the advertisers fit your show, and host reads are the best by all means. But any questions on anything about if you haven't, like I say, the show called The Intern. Yeah. 2 pre-rolls, 2 mid-rolls, and 2 post-rolls. And I was really amazed because he didn't used to have that many. I don't want to throw his network under the bus, but it rhymes with Cod Bass Done. There we go. That is doing that. And I'm about ready. Well, I've gone from there you go, Todd. Thank you. I didn't throw them under the bus. Todd did. And so it's interesting because I've gone from subscribing to a show that now they don't automatically download. If I'm out of podcasts, I will now look at that, and if I don't recognize the name, I don't download it. And here's a guy where, going back to my original point of show notes, because if you're wondering, how did we get there? Show notes, Jay only puts like a sentence and a half. He'll be like, today we talk with Flora, Fina. And I'm like, who's Flora Fina? And he'll put your name on it. Okay, well, I don't know who Flora Fina is, so I'm not listening, Jay. But if he said Flora Fina, who, only has one leg and walked across the United States in 72 hours, I'd be like, wow, that's an amazing story. I might listen to that. But you got to give people a reason to do that. So, but it's interesting watching. We talked earlier about the documentary. I mean, money changes everything. Advertising can make podcasters that I really, really respected make decisions that I kind of go, really? Because I know Elsie Escobar, who does She Podcast, was saying there's a new show, I think it's on Gimlet, called Two Dope Queens. And they're running, I think they said Squarespace ads on it. And it just doesn't seem to fit their target audience. But when you've got a big network and you got slots to fill, I guess you'll fill them up with anything. So what do we got? We're down to about 10 minutes. So the other thing I did mention earlier, and I definitely want to hit this point. I mentioned how having a big launch is stopping some people from launching their podcast. Please don't let that do that, because no matter what you do, your first episode will make you cringe when you're on episode number 10. And the other thing the other thing I want to point out, just because we have a lot of podcasters here, is that please subscribe to your show, your very own show. I know you know it. You don't need the content. Please subscribe to your own show. And the reason I say this is I help a lot of people that are panicking because they put out an episode and it's, I released it at 6:00 this morning. It's 1:00 now. It's not in iTunes. and they start to panic. They're like, oh my gosh, nobody's getting my podcast because it's not in iTunes. Realize, here is your podcast. He said, putting his hand up here in the thing. All iTunes is, it's a mirror. It mirrors whatever is in your podcast. And so iTunes has like whatever, 200,000 podcasts to go around and update the mirror. And so that's why if you look at Apple specs, they say it takes up to 24 hours once you release an episode for the episode, and here's the key here, to show up in the iTunes listings, the listings. Now, if you subscribe to your show, your subscribers, and that's why we want people to subscribe, get that file almost immediately. But, and that's why I say it's because you can look at it in iTunes and go, yep, there's 1 through 5, but I've got 6 episodes. Where's my 6th episode? Where is my 6th episode? And you're freaking out. And I understand why. And the minute you go subscribe, show it in my library, bing, there it is. So it's just a case that iTunes hasn't refreshed or whatever it is they do, that it shows up in the listing. So that's another great reason why you can tell people to subscribe to your show. If you want this to be available to you, the minute that it's available, subscribe to the show. And because I just want people white knuckling it. I don't want them getting on the ledge. I want to talk you off the ledge before you get on it, because it's really easy to look at iTunes and go, oh my gosh, it's not working. No, it is working. Subscribe to your show. Now, if you subscribe to your show and it's not there, then you got a problem with your feed, and that's when you got to get a hold of your support people. But I've run into that a lot this week. Also, if you're using FeedBurner, this week has been like FeedBurner week. One of the things it does, if you go into your show, again, subscribing to your own show, and you see that every episode has the exact same title, you might be using FeedBurner. You might be using FeedBurner if you go to change your artwork and it doesn't update in iTunes for a week. It's probably because between here's iTunes, here's FeedBurner, and here's you update FeedBurner, and FeedBurner's going, it's just sleeping. It just went to, I don't know, it went out for a beer and never came back. And so it's not getting the new information. So you got to go over and kick the tires on it. And that's why most of us say, don't use FeedBurner. But there's been a lot of problems this week to where it's worse than usual. So, and there's an easy way you can go into, whether you're using PowerPress or if you're using a Libsyn feed or if you're using a Spreaker feed or whoever, that you can actually go over and put a link in your feed that says, hey, this is new, and then basically tell FeedBurner or tell, yes. So iTunes, well, this is always fun in audio format. iTunes is looking at FeedBurner. FeedBurner is looking at your feed. So you go over to FeedBurner and say, hey, look at this feed, and this feed says, hey, iTunes, if you ever see me, just quit looking at FeedBurner. So here's iTunes. iTunes goes through FeedBurner, comes over here and sees your feed and says, hey, look, there's a note here that says, quit looking at FeedBurner. Look directly at me. And you just got FeedBurner out of the thing. And now iTunes looks directly at you. And so now no more stalling from FeedBurner. And again, I just don't want you to get on the ledge and go, what's wrong with my show? FeedBurner was a great idea back in 2006. But I always tell people now it's a little bit like working, like saying, hey, let's go listen to some music. Great. I got some 8-track tapes. Not exactly high fidelity. So keep that in mind. And in last week's episode of the School of Podcasting, if you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/533, somebody told me that podcasting is a Ponzi scheme. And that is just, there are people at the top that are trying to tell people there is no discovery problem and just buy our books on our products and, buy our hosting and things like that. It's just a big sham. And I went over and looked at the person. And first of all, I get this person's point of view. He said, look, I'm doing audiobooks and I actually made $50 doing audiobooks. I'm like, well, by all means, if that's what you're in for, if you're in it for the money, you're probably going to find more money in audiobooks, at least if you're looking for, quote, quick cash. And then I went looking for his podcast and what he had done to save money. And again, I understand that. Sometimes you don't have $45 for hosting. Is he had one feed with 3 shows in the feed because he bought a big plan and then he put multiple shows in it. Well, the problem was you could type in the name of the show like the actual name of his show, into iTunes, and it wouldn't show up. To which I say, I think I found a discoverability problem. And then I typed in a second show because he named his feed the title of his network. So if you hear that episode, there is not a, well, I don't want to say there's not a discovery problem, but there wasn't one for Serial. There wasn't one. My latest example of this is Liz Covert does Ben Franklin's World. Now, I don't know about you, I was not exactly on the edge of my seat in American history class. I was probably in the back passing notes and ready to fall asleep because I just found it incredibly boring. And Liz does not. She loves that subject, and she has over 1 million downloads. And you're like, well, great. What does she have? Like 700 episodes out? Nope, she's got 100. So do the math. That's a lot of downloads for American history. So when you do it right, you make it entertaining, you can get the downloads. And she didn't have a discoverability problem. I don't remember seeing her stuff on a platform. I don't remember Gimlet promoting her. So when you get the right stuff, and keep in mind that when it comes to growing your audience, my favorite little equation is the amount of value that you have in your episode, and you multiply that by the amount of smart promotion. Now, what is smart promotion? Smart promotion is, hey, if you're doing a knitting cast, probably going to the Slipknot concert and handing out business cards is probably, I don't think a lot of Slipknot fans are crocheting. It's a guess. And I could be wrong. There's always exceptions to the rule, but I don't think a lot of crocheting is going on at the Slipknot concert. So the value in your episode multiplied by the amount of smart promotion you do equals the number of downloads. And so, well, what if I do a lot of smart promotion, but there's no value? Well, that's called, do you guys, and I'm stealing this from Rob Walsh from Libsyn. Do you guys remember the movie The Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp in it? Right, there's tons of promotion about that movie, and heck, it's got Johnny Depp, and he's hot. And but the movie was just a stinker, and it cost $80 bazillion to make and made nothing at the box office. So just promotion isn't going to do it, because the first people went out the first weekend and went, hey, wow, it's Johnny Depp. Hey, wow, this movie stinks. And what did they do? They told all their friends. And the second week, nobody went. Why? Because everybody said, yeah, don't go. Save your $20 and don't go. So it's not just promotion. You've got to have value in there. So when you have value and you do have promotion, then you get the downloads. But to do that, you have to go where your audience is. You have to make friends with them. You have to do that. Then tell them about your podcast. And because you've made friends with them, they'll want to know more about your podcast. And then they'll download, and then they will tell their friends. So that's it. Oh, cool. Daryl Darnell and friends. Beautiful. So, and Mr. Dave, thank you for the opportunity, man, for coming on.
Absolutely, Dave. Thanks for sharing the message of The Messengers, a podcast documentary, and some of your tips and tricks from
yeah, I thought I'm not going to be able to talk about that for an hour, but we'll do some tips and tricks at the end here.
No, we love that. Yeah, and to follow up Stephen A. Hart's session with yours too. I think if you guys are in the chat room, or if you even check out the replay, you guys are going to get a ton of value from what Stephen and also Dave just laid out here. So, Dave, I appreciate you tuning in. One more time for people that aren't familiar, go ahead and drop your website so that people know where to connect with you.
Yeah, you can find me at schoolofpodcasting.com, and in an hour and 4 minutes, that will be wide open for people to join, because it'll be in Eastern time, international podcasting. So that's when the flip is going to be switched. So see me over there. So, and then Steve and Dave, while I have you here, just thanks for all the work you guys have been doing. This is it's looking great. So
thank you. I appreciate it. So thank you, Dave, for checking in and broadcasting with us on International Podcast Day. We will see you around.
Thanks, buddy.